YouTuber Jessica Petway has died. She was 36 years old. According to E! News, the beauty influencer's sister confirmed her death on Instagram. The mournful tribute revealing Jessica died last week, nearly a year after she first shared her devastating diagnosis, stage 3 cervical cancer.
Anka Molnar, a renowned makeup artist to celebrities and a prominent influencer on TikTok, has tragically passed away after ignoring what can be a critical sign of cancer.
That's Tony Award winner and musical Broadway veteran Gavin Creel, who passed away at age 48 Monday after a battle with cancer.
Dr. Darian here with us, and we are talking about rare cancers and the numbers of them post-COVID. What's going on here?
So kind of an extension on our discussion earlier this week, talking about this rise in the rate of cancer, specifically rare cancers. And there has been much discussion and a new Washington Post article that really goes into this, about this discussion on anecdotal reports and small evidence that associates COVID infections with the development of cancer.
So we're still ignoring the elephant in the room, I see. Hello everyone, if you're a new viewer, welcome. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. If this is your second, third, fourth time watching one of my videos and you're not yet subscribed, we already go together. Okay, make it official and hit that subscribe button. Today's video is likely going to get suppressed in the algorithm. So I'm going to ask you guys in advance, if you get anything out of this video, please hit the like button. Please leave a comment, even if it's just like a thumbs up emoji, because the more people engage with this video, the more the algorithm will see that people are interested in it, and it will help this video not get overshadowed by the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni bullshit. I can't believe that story is still dragging on like 6 months later. Meanwhile, people forgot about the SUV-sized drones that emerged from the ocean and were apparently being flown by hobbyists. But I digress. In this video, I want to talk about the rise in cancer we have seen after the introduction of a certain product that was hoisted upon us and that many people took. You know, I always thought it was very odd that King Charles and Kate Middleton both got cancer at the same time. Like if two people in a household got sick from botulism, for example, which is very rare, we would assume that those two people must have gotten it from the same source because they both got sick at the same time, and they both got sick at the same time with a rare illness. And I personally have heard these stories in my own life, not on the internet, but in my own personal life. I've heard stories of people who say, yes, my mother and my father took this thing and they both were diagnosed with cancer very shortly after. And all over social media, when you read the comment sections of posts, you see stories of people who say they know someone who has developed a very aggressive form of cancer after getting this injection. A Twitter user by the name of Kennedy has posted about her personal life and her experience surviving a rare form of blood cancer after taking the injection, and she strongly believes the injection was the cause. Zachary Levi, the actor who starred in Shazam, was friends with actor Gavin Creel, who was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer in July of 2024 and died just a few months later in September of 2024. And Zachary is adamant that the shot is what took his friend's life.
So a few weeks ago, my friend, Gavin Creel, died. He was 48 years old. He was one of the healthiest people I knew. I would always want to go and get drinks afterwards, and a few of us would always go get drinks, and Gavin would always be like, nah, I gotta go home, and I gotta be with my dog. And he ate well, he took care of himself, he was active, he was a healthy man. And a few weeks ago, out of nowhere, I'm on Instagram and I see a mutual friend had posted that Gavin had died. And I, without a shadow of a doubt, I believe that Gavin Creel would be alive right now if that stuff didn't get put into his body.
When I started researching for this video, it was a very interesting endeavor because most mainstream sources are paid by Big Pharma and they protect Big Pharma. When I used Google for my search, I came across this article from CTV News, which called it a myth. However, when I clicked on the page not found. Maybe they took the page down because it had misinformation. Who knows, but what I do know is that bias in the media is a problem, especially surrounding topics like this. And that's why it's important to have places to go to get your information with as much transparency as possible. And that is why I use longtime friend to the channel and sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Now, Ground News is a platform that I trust, and you can check them out by scanning the QR code on the screen or by heading to ground.news/NCS for 40% off. Ground News is a website and app that gathers news from all around the world and all sides of the political spectrum in one place, which allows you to compare coverage and verify your information. For example, check out this story. RFK Jr. eyes childhood vaccine schedule review. Says nothing off limits in HHS meeting. Ground News provides 40 sources for this story, 24% right-leaning, 61% centrist, and only 15% left-leaning. And just by comparing the headlines, we can see the difference in the reporting. For example, this headline from a left-leaning source: Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is defiantly ignorant, which is why he's so dangerous. Compared to this headline from a right-leaning source: he's going to focus on prevention, doctor says of RFK Jr. The left-leaning source is demonizing RFK by calling him defiantly ignorant, while the right-leaning source is more neutral and is focusing on his intent. In the past, I found it difficult to keep up with all of the news events happening all around the world, especially because not every topic piques my interest, and so I use my Vantage subscription to create a custom news feed to see the topics that interest me. I simply go to my interests and I select the topic that I want to appear in my feed, such as entertainment, Canadian politics, US politics, movies and TV. If there is a specific country, company, or public figure that I'm interested in, I can add those to my interest list, and all news related to those topics will appear in my feed. I've been working with Ground News for over a year now because I sincerely see the value in their platform. They're not looking to persuade people's opinions, they just present the information so that you can make your own decision, and I highly recommend you check them out. I'm giving my viewers 40% off this unlimited access plan, which you can access by scanning the QR code on the screen or by going to ground.news/NCS. Subscribing not only supports my work, you're also supporting an independent platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. A special thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. So going back to the question, is there a link to the shot and people developing very aggressive forms of cancer? Many people, much smarter than me and more qualified than me, have said yes. Take, for example, Kevin McKernan, who is a molecular biologist. Kevin is the Chief Scientific Officer and founder of Medicinal Genomics Corporation. Kevin has spent his career researching and developing various DNA sequencing technologies in both the research and clinical industries. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that Kevin is the type of person who is qualified to speak on the shot. And not even just the shot, but the way that the pandemic as a whole was handled. For example, do you remember when we had to do those PCR tests? When you wanted to get into certain places or do certain things, you had to take those PCR tests with the stick, this long stick, and they shove it up your nose, and when they pulled it out, all your dignity came out with it, this thing. And most of the time the results were unreliable because they often came back with false positives. Well, Kevin's company specializes in gene sequencing and creating PCR tests for cannabis plants. The tests he makes are to ensure that the plants are healthy and that do not contain diseases that can spoil the crops or be passed on to humans. And here is what he said about the PCR tests that they were giving us to shove up our noses.
Before I dove into that, I did spend some work on PCR as well. Since my background is in that field, I noticed that the COVID tests that were coming to market, they wouldn't pass our industry standards. And we have probably lighter standards than others. And that's mainly because they don't have an internal control in the PCR. So the first one that came out was the Strawston PCR test that ended up on the WHO's website before it even got through peer review. Went to a journal where the editors were on the editorial board and went through peer review in like 26 hours, which is lightning fast for anyone who's familiar with peer review. And some of the people had undisclosed conflicts in testing companies. So an internal control is you have to look for the host DNA as well as the virus DNA to know the ratio, right? So how many cells did you swab? How many viruses are there compared to the number of host cells? And if you don't measure both, you're really just getting a number in space that's not very meaningful.
So in simple terms, the tests that they were giving us were not sophisticated enough to detect whether a person was infectious or not, which doesn't surprise me because we always had all those false positives. But also, Kevin mentioned that quarantining and social distancing did more harm than good because it slowed down herd immunity.
So the main issue with the COVID PCR was that they were not distinguishing between infectiousness. And when it comes down to medical ethics, you're not supposed to quarantine someone who's not infectious. If they've recovered and they still have RNA floating around, you can actually do more harm than good because you're now quarantining all the people who are recovered. That's your herd. The whole concept of herd immunity is about people who have already recovered from it. And they could still be RNA positive with PCR. You start flagging those people, and then you put in a contact tracing system that flags their whole family and their whole household when they're all recovered. and you suddenly start pulling the entire immune herd out of the population. So herd immunity can never actually be reached. Herd immunity is dependent on there being people who are recovered in the population, so they act as sort of a buffer, so the virus, when it hits them, can't go anywhere else. And if you're actively removing those people from the population with PCR tests that doesn't discern whether you're infectious or whether you have dead viral RNA, you can do more harm to the epidemiology of the disease. What I find somewhat morbid and ironic about all this is that they pulled out the use of antibiotics under the guise that, hey, we don't want to get antibiotic resistance. Yet they didn't have that same concern when they wanted to vaccinate the entire population at the same time. And viruses evolve faster than bacteria, right? There are viruses that mutate. So you should be very afraid of giving everybody the same treatment at the same time in the middle of a pandemic with the vaccine. On top of that, they mixed in remdesivir and they mixed in molnupiravir, which are mutagens, which accelerate the virus's mutation rate. And they can track these now, and they can see that drug is actually creating new variants, feeding the vaccine pipeline.
So in case you didn't catch that, he said that the shot contains ingredients that causes the virus to mutate more quickly, which creates variants more quickly, which artificially created the need for new shots to keep up with the new variants. That is diabolical. It was also mentioned during the podcast that the shot includes ingredients that suppress immunity.
For people who had 2 or more of the mRNA-based shots, they show the production of this special class of antibody, IgG4,
Right.
which is actually a signal that the body uses to turn down immunity.
It is,
So,
it's a tolerance antibody. So the body's basically getting trained to tolerate a pathogen so that you don't clear it in the future. And so that whole IgG4 class switching is, it may even be playing a role in cancer.
So as I mentioned, Kevin's company specializes in gene sequencing and PCR tests for weed or cannabis. And one day, he and his team were sequencing the RNA of infected cannabis plants. While they were running their tests, their library stopped working, and so they needed to troubleshoot. Rather than continue to use their cannabis samples, they went into the freezer and they pulled out some vials of the COVID vaccine from Pfizer. Now, the reason they had them was because people had sent them to him for him to run tests on, but he never ended up doing so, and then they expired, and he just had them sitting in the freezer. And these were sealed and they had never been tampered with, and so he decided to use those to troubleshoot. And this was when he accidentally discovered that the COVID vaccines from Pfizer contain DNA in them.
And that was kind of a wake-up moment for us, because we weren't setting out to run around and whistleblow on this. We were just using this as a control. And once you see it's contaminated, you have to either bury it and then you're responsible for everything, or you come out public with it and you get sued. We realized the only approach was to go public, but we have to guard against getting sued. So we're going to have to sequence this many more times and use many different methods to make sure we're not off here. After we did that, and we also made the decision, we got to put everything public, like on the fly, even the stuff that doesn't work. Like, there's going to be flaws. We're going to get picked apart, but we got to be transparent. And every experiment we do, just put it on Substack and move on, because that's the best way to sort of cover our bases here. Ours were completely sealed, tamper resistant, but they had sat on the shelf longer than their expiration date. It's a really bad point for them to hammer on, because that only reveals the fact that they were injecting people with expired vials. This is something that happened throughout the pandemic, is whenever they'd expire, Pfizer would extend the expiration date. So they were consistently using expired vials. It's not necessarily a good argument against our work, and it's somewhat it doesn't matter. It's water under the bridge, because other people have now done this on vials that weren't expired and found the same thing.
The interviewer, Brett Weinstein, goes on to explain that when the shot was under an emergency order, the product was approved without the inclusion of DNA plasma.
The DNA sequence itself in the plasmid does have some concern. There's some elements in there that do concern. It's a vector that Pfizer borrowed from their gene therapy. And so it has components in there that are traditionally used for gene therapy. It gets into this big rabbit hole of SV40. That was not in the original vaccine. It is now in the current vaccines that are going on the shelf. It's not the whole virus. This is parts of that virus that they've hijacked and put into this plasmid, because they're very effective at moving DNA into the nucleus, and they replicate once they get inside the mammalian cells. So these shuttle vectors mean that the plasmids can replicate that DNA in a lot of different biological organisms.
So simian virus 40 is a tool borrowed from nature, from a simian virus, for a purpose in gene therapy, which is to transport DNA into the nucleus of cells, and it sounds like it's rather indifferent to what kind of cell.
Yes.
One thing is that this process that Pfizer was using to actually make the shots that it injected into people utilized this thing, and it was not purified out, which is frightening, because the last thing you want to do is be told, oh, take this injection. What's in it? Lipid nanoparticle. Well, that should set off an alarm bell. And mRNA, which won't last very long, because mRNAs don't last very long, except that it's been hyper-stabilized.
Right.
So you're being injected with an inflammatory, at the very least, lipid nanoparticle. You're being injected with mRNA that isn't normal mRNA, that causes your ribosomes to misread things and sticks around indefinitely. We don't know how long it lasts. We know that every time somebody tests to see if it's still there, it is. So a very long last. It's a very unnatural thing. But what's more, to add insult to injury, these vials are containing a biologically potent factor that transports genes into the nucleus. So the point is, you're composed of 30 trillion cells. Except for your red blood cells, they've all got nuclei, and somebody's injecting you now with a magic molecule that transports genetic material into the nuclei of cells?
Hundreds of billions per shot, yes.
This is insane.
So in the interview, Kevin explains how SV40 promoter came to be in the vaccines. He gives a very technical explanation that I had to watch like 18 times just to understand, because I'm just a lay person. But now that I understand it, I'm going to explain it to you guys. So essentially what he was saying is that when they were making this vaccine, they had the spike protein and they needed to put the mRNA into the spike protein. And to do this, they used SV40 promoter. And then what they should have done was they should have filtered out all of the SV40 promoter so that they were just left with this spike protein with mRNA. However, that's not what happened. The SV40 was still in the vaccines, and that is what has been injected into people. And he also says that this process with using SV40 was never disclosed to the FDA. What was submitted to the FDA was an entirely different process that didn't include SV40.
Download SnapGene, it'll take you 5 minutes, load up Pfizer sequencing file. What do you see? It annotates SV40 automatically. Someone had to go in there and manually remove it and then submit a edited version to the FDA. Now, 3 agencies have now responded on this. So the FDA, Health Canada, and the EMA have all admitted that Pfizer sent them a sequence file, but did not fill out the SV40 component. They didn't annotate it. So they've admitted that they were not aware of this. And we now have from some FOIAs from Noah Chartier and another gentleman on Twitter and on Substack called Scoops Magoo. They've been going after Health Canada with ATIPs, which are like FOIAs in the United States, to get all their emails. And they can see in email that they were not aware of this, that they've asked Pfizer to remove it. They've also asked Pfizer to measure how long the DNA is. They asked Pfizer for a length analysis, and Pfizer replied saying they don't have an assay for that. So that's counter to what the health agencies have been saying publicly. They've been telling people that it's too small amounts of matter, it's short in length. So they've been telling the public things they actually don't have answers to.
Remember when they told us to trust the science? Well, I'm going to trust this guy's science over Pfizer's science because he has no reason to lie. And Pfizer has been caught in lies. This is scandalous.
This SV40 component that David Dean has published on being a gene therapy tool, it's also been published by by Draymond et al., which shows that it interacts with P53. So there's
you want to describe what P53 is when you say guardian of the genome?
Yeah, so this is probably the most cited gene in cancer. And if you mess with P53, you're inviting cancer, particularly if you shut it down. This mops up DNA that's been damaged. And now you're injecting your cells with these shrapnel DNA, that triggers that pathway. That triggers what's known as a CGAS sting pathway, which is a pathway that when it sees broken DNA like that, interferon goes off being like, there's something wrong here. We shouldn't have fragmented DNA inside the cytosol or in the nucleus. That pathway alone, if you trigger it enough repeatedly, can lead to oncogenesis. So there is a lot of debunkers out there that try to say you can't prove this DNA is getting into the nucleus based on David Dean's work. It doesn't have to get into the nucleus to cause cancer. If just cytosolic presence of fragments of DNA like this can trigger this CGAS sting pathway. So I've been trying to turn people's attention to cancer mainly because I'm seeing it. I know kids that shouldn't have cancer because they got vaccinated. And these are very rare cancers that you don't find in children that are showing up in close proximity to usually blood cancers like lymphoma. And I happen to be in the same state as John Bodwin. He'd be a really good guest because he has done so much work on FOIAing these death records. He can see all the shenanigans where these people are getting hit with these vaccines and getting labeled as COVID deaths. And the death certificates are helping to draw some attention to this. But I think his is the best epidemiological data we have. It doesn't have confounders. You actually have the death certificate, and you have a lot of personal information there that is protected under HIPAA that allows you to triangulate their death to a VAERS record. VAERS record doesn't have personal identified information in there because it is protected by HIPAA, but once you're dead, death records do not. So he's been able to triangulate a lot of these death records to VAERS reports, and you can see that the VAERS reports oftentimes don't agree with the death record. The VAERS reports will say it's a vaccine injury, the death record will say they put it down as COVID. So there's a lot of that going on. And he can see an increase in certain cancer types, blood cancers in particular.
So hold on.
It might be related to this mechanism.
Okay. Again, we see an echo of that same style of perverse incentive, where if you can take something that is a vaccine adverse event death and you can shove it over into the category of COVID,
it's 2 for 1.
It makes the vaccines look safer than they are. and it makes COVID look more dangerous than they are, which then tends to sell vaccines.
Yes.
So once again, none of this makes any sense unless you make the assumption that whoever's making the decisions is perfectly fine killing people.
What dawned on me was that they are now marketing vaccines to treat cancer. So they have created the problem and they are now offering a solution. Diabolical.
One of the most exciting things we're working on is a cancer vaccine, and using AI to look at the blood test, you can find the cancers that are actually seriously threatening the person. Once we gene sequence that cancer tumor, you can then vaccinate the person, design a vaccine for every individual person to vaccinate them against that cancer.
Anyways, that is all I have for this video. If you liked it, please don't forget to hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. All of the sources will be in the comment section down below, so you can check those out for yourself. If you'd like to support my channel, you can find me on Patreon. That will also be linked in the comment section down below, or you can check out the sponsor of today's video. If you liked this video and you would like to see 2 more like it, I will have 2 more videos for you in the end cards. I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye.